One. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happenstance into this incredible panel dialogue that's been happening. And I'm so grateful to this illustrious group of people that have joined on a pretty much a weekly basis, and our audience is growing. So thank you for tuning in. Quick introductions. Well, first, we're recording on May 2nd, Friday, May 2nd, 2025 at approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And a couple of quick introductions immediately to my left, which I've learned when I've rewatched these, it turns out to be my right. So I'll say she's going to appear on my right. Carbone, sorry, the Rabina Chair of Science, Technology, and Law at the University of Minnesota. And of course, I'll include a link to all of her prolific writings and books down below. To my immediate left would be William K. Black, criminologist, specialist in economics, I'm sorry, and criminology, as well as, of course, the law, best known for the savings and loan crisis. Immediately below is Mark Dan, of course, of Dan Law, former attorney general of the great state of Ohio. And then, of course, David K. Johnston, the prolific journalist who has revealed probably more details about Donald Trump than anybody in the business, all things considered. And guys, we've seen a lot of reaction to the first 100 days of the administration with things that continue to come at us left and right. Of course, this week we saw the horrific behavior of what appears to be ICE and company, and I believe Homeland Security in the incident involving the families of women in Oklahoma City, and I'm sure we'll address that as well. But I think I want to ask you. I think I want to start with David. Actually, David, what are your? You've been out there discussing Donald in detail a lot. I mean, obviously, you've got a lot of thoughts on the subject. What's
Well,
sort of
the most fun observation I've seen is from someone who said that William Henry Harrison had 100 better days and he was dead for 70 of them. Um, Donald is now, in his own mind, America's dictator, and he's simply consolidating power. First the Gulf of America, then renaming Veterans Day, and if we just jump to the end game, we will rename the country the United States of Trump. And Donald believes everything he's doing is righteous and proper, and it should be exactly as he's doing it. His renewed statement today that he will revoke Harvard's nonprofit status is indicative of his lawlessness. First of all, there is a section of the Internal Revenue Code Congress passed that the president, the vice president, or people on their behalf may not interfere in the operations of the IRS. If someone has a complaint, they can forward it. That's about the end of it. But I'm sure that Donald's minions will revoke or attempt to revoke the 501c3 status of Harvard, which will go to court and which will win, even with this Supreme Court. But the thing not to miss is that, except for only partially replacing generals and admirals with loyalists, Donald is 100% on the march to consolidate his position so that he is the unassailable dictator of the United States. And the Democrats only seem to be able to say, please send money. So,
Well, that is an incredibly important point. Boy, and I have seen that firsthand in a number of places, and so thank you for making that, David. Bill, you had made a comment earlier today about kind of the robustness of this ridiculousness that Trump is infusing alongside of what David Kay just pointed out. But you want to further that thought?
Sure. So Trump outside the United States has managed to swing elections by about 30 plus points in Canada. The current polls show a 30-point swing in Mexico and a 30-point swing in Australia. There's something very much unique about Americans' inability to understand this complete tin pot despot and the reaction of the rest of the world, which is able to see through this extremely well. And of course, we've had the first economics numbers to come in the United States, the first quarter numbers. And so I, used AI just before this to ask how many of the G20 economies have reported negative growth for the first quarter, and AI told me one. We're number one in falling in GDP in the United States. And I would just turn around, slightly more accurate on the phrase, that the U.S. economy under Biden was the envy of the world. It was actually the driver. Absent the U.S. growth, the rest of the world would have probably been in recession or under 1% growth, as indeed many of the folks were. So we have not only taken away that engine of growth with this self-inflicted wound of the tariffs, we have caused the International Monetary Fund and all the other types to reassess what's likely. And in every single case, the projection is for dramatically lower growth because of this self-inflicted wound.
Well, but further to that as well, I mean, those are all incredibly huge, monumental issues with tons of gravity for millions of people, right? But the ridiculousness as well was on display earlier today. I believe that in addition to making the proclamation that not only does Donald run the country solely, was the inference, but also, regardless of what he happened to say in that interview a couple of days ago, when he said he only takes orders from his lawyers, I thought was intriguing as it relates to the nonsense about MS-13 and all of the the changes, to the pictures and so on and so forth. But also, you had mentioned, Bill, I mean, didn't he make the proclamation? And oh yeah, by the way, I own a department store.
Yeah, and that's the key thing. He used the word own, the department store, and the metaphor was to the entire U.S. economy. And then he said, of course, that he ran it on behalf of the United States people. But, who gave him ownership of this thing? Um, and he said he determined all the prices that'll be charged in the economy. So David Kay, in a number of occasions, and I've added on some, has talked about mercantilism and the insanity that it produced. But this is really full company store stuff, because what prices is he choosing to charge us in this company store? Well, he's decided to raise the prices through what is a tariffs, which is equivalent essentially to a sales tax. And everybody knows who ends up really paying a sales tax. That'd be us, the consumers. So he's running a store on our behalf by jacking up the prices and saying this is the only place we can buy. Thanks, Donald.
So obviously, he's train wrecked the economy and in the process of making it worse, not to mention, of course, the law and all things the first 100 days. But June, you have pointed out, in previous discussions, your background, your expertise, and a lot of research and study into corporate sort of control and manipulation of women in the workplace and that sort of thing. But in addition to that, I'm sure it must have been difficult to see this story out of Oklahoma City as a result of ICE and Department of Homeland Security, and I believe the FBI as well, terrorizing women that were American citizens that were held at gunpoint in the rain when they were apparently mistakenly identified as whoever was going to be pretty much sent out of the country next.
Well, this is one of the things, and David Kay has been more of an expert on this than I have. What is Trump trying to do? He's a showman. He's putting on a story. We're tough, we're ruthless, we're going to get stuff done, and we think immigrants are beneath consideration. Cruelty is the point. And so when you look behind that story, what you find is that he promised mass deportations, and he hasn't done it. And he hasn't done it because, first, the low-hanging fruit, the people with actual criminal records, were being deported by Biden. In fact, Obama's deportation numbers are higher than Trump's, and they were targeted at people who had committed crimes. He doesn't have a whole lot of criminals to go after that he can find easily. So how do you get mass deportations? You go after the whole community. And you do it. Again, I want to emphasize, and I've been emphasizing this. How did Musk run his factories? By saying, I want these production numbers. I don't care if Teslas fall apart on the road. As long as we meet these numbers, we fix them in the next production run. How did Jack Welch deal with things at GE? By saying, I want my numbers. I want quarterly earnings boosted. And if we get the numbers wrong, oh, well, the stock market will reward us this quarter, and next quarter we'll have them fixed. The numbers. Actual production doesn't matter so much for GE. And so that's what Trump's doing. He's putting on a show. But I want to call attention to the second half of that show, and that is who he's trying to appeal to. Because one of the things I find terrifying is who the Trump base is. So I wrote a book back in 2010 with Naomi Kahn, Red Families versus Blue Families. We were trying to talk about the divergence in family values that came up in the 2004 election. And then we were trying to map it on how different policies on the family in different parts of the country were moving apart. But what we found was that what makes this area of American history unique and particularly pernicious is when you look at ideological polarization, you are not just seeing the sorting into conservatives versus liberals. What you're seeing across society is a sorting by psychological types. So there are a variety of ways of describing them. I like the cultural cognition framework, and it distinguishes hierarchs, people who believe some people are better than others, and of course my group is better than others, and if it's not winning, something's wrong with the system, versus egalitarians, and individualists versus communitarians. And to sum it up, I like this story. How many conservatives does it take to change a light bulb? Two. One to tell the other to do it. How many liberals does it take to change a light bulb? Can't be done. One would have to rise above the other to reach the ceiling. And if you think of these as psychological types, now what you see happen, let's start with religion. Across religions, and one of the things that is unusual about the United States is we pick our churches. We don't just go to the church down the street. We go to the church with the pastor who appeals to our prejudices, whatever they
For,
happen to
for,
be.
for now, June, for now.
Yes. In my childhood, we all went to the local Catholic church. It didn't matter whether you were liberal or conservative. In my family, it didn't even matter all that much whether you were devout or an atheist. We still went to the same church. We were Catholics, and we were Catholics because we were Italian. So we didn't sort on any kind of political dimension. But today, look at every church. Among Jews, the Orthodox congregations have grown. Among Protestants, the move toward fundamentalism began in the 60s with the quote being the middle dropped out of the American church. Among Catholics, that's only started to happen more recently. But the people who go to church more than once a week are distinctly different and more zealous on a variety of characteristics than those who don't. And when we talk about Christian nationalism, we are talking about an overlap of a mindset that is hierarchical, autocratic, and right now fueled by resentment and has abandoned the teachings of Jesus Christ. And when you now apply that to what is taking place in Oklahoma City, what you're seeing is cruelty is the point. When you ask a question about the poor, okay, and remember, Jesus was all about feeding the poor. But when you ask a question about the poor, are they there because the system is rigged or because, they're lazy, incompetent, they deserve their fate? Republicans are the largest group in the country to say because they're lazy, incompetent, and deserve their faith. And white Christian evangelicals are the second largest group to buy into that. And that means it is a mindset that today combines autocratic tendencies, a desire to punish opponents, um, a grievance mindset that is very unchristian. I really want to emphasize this. And a feeling that when you see Trump doing what he's doing, even if it's the wrong address, they're cheering. And that's been there in the Republican base, certainly since the Bush 2. And it's scary and it's impenetrable. So, to be more optimistic, David, I heard you say uh, uh, on air that, people actually do notice when the economy heads south. They lose their jobs, the price of eggs go up. But there is this mindset at the core of the base that is now cult-like. And it's cult-like, and there are a variety of statistics indicating that. It used to be, and this is what we traced in our book, it used to be, people had religious views on abortion and they started becoming more Republican because the Republican Party shared those religious views. During the second Bush administration, people who identified as conservative Republicans became anti-abortion, even if they weren't religious or belonged to a church that was not anti-abortion. So it became a marker. And today, what you are seeing is the Trump identity, the MAGA identity is becoming primary and church attendance secondary in defining people's identity. And that shift toward a group that is cheering on the destruction of the United States, if only the right people end up on top at the end, is terrifying.
Boy, that darkness, Mark, personifies and echoes a lot of what you've pointed out a couple of times throughout the last several weeks. You use the analogy of the Handmaid's Tale, but you also have, really hung a lantern and raised the alarm on fascism, of course, which is remarkable coming from the position that you are. I'm going to ask you kind of a compounded question to see if you can resolve something you introduced last week in context of what June just said, given what led into that, the situation with these women that were terrorized by the groups, the federal, obviously,
And
ISIS
children.
and children. Oh yeah, and that's the next level, of it, right? The 2-year-old that was sent away because of they had cancer, and that's a whole other aspect of this. But Mark, you had mentioned last week that you were potentially going to go to a hearing, I believe, in D.C. because of what you had pointed out based on the CFPB. I wonder if you can kind of start there and then maybe try to unpack some of this other stuff that June just introduced.
Right. Well, the DC Circuit actually rescued the CFPB for the moment, and so even though they spent the weekend setting up for trial and read fascinating documents, they basically the way they were going to dismantle the CFPB, the plans were made on Post-it notes, and those Post-it notes are now have been filed as exhibits. So if anybody wants to look at it, it's available on Pacer, and literally picking numbers out of the air for the number of people necessary to meet the statutory duties of uh, each prong of the Dodd-Frank enabling statute for the CFPB. But that all became moot when the Court of Appeals said we never our review of the stay and our adjustment of the stay that the trial judge entered never meant what the Trump administration decided it meant, to be able to lay off all those people. So it took the issue away, and so far they're abiding by that order. And so we never got to see that day in court where they had to put up or shut up, and where Vogt and Mark Pauletta could be cross-examined by very good lawyers. But that day will come. I've never wished more that the federal courts were open to cameras than I am at this time, because I think we could learn so much, and I think the public could learn so much by watching good lawyers. And and there's still a lot of us who are still out there fighting this battle, doing their job, and getting to the truth. Because as fiery and as antagonistic and as much as people want to make their own truth, there really is only one truth. And the best way that I've seen to be able to identify that within guardrails is in the court system in the United States. It's really developed into something very, very special and unique. And until it's not, which I hope that day won't come. But June, here's my optimistic take on this. I think we're at a point now. We're getting closer to the point, and I think we will get to the point not too long from now, where people stop believing. What the MAGA folks and the folks from and the traditional Republic or the business Republicans have in common is that they both believe the means justify the ends.
Mm-hmm.
The business community has waited 40 years to have these regulatory agencies gutted. I think they're going to regret that wish and making it a reality, because it's going to be very difficult to do business in this country when there aren't clear rules and boundaries. And ethical businesses are going to cease to exist, and unethical businesses are not. And the fact that is that the costs are going to start to apply. Right now, people's lives haven't really changed at home. I go on, I'm running, I'm representing my clients, I'm running my cases, everybody's doing their job. They're going to the store, there's food on the shelves. That's going to change here very shortly with the way that these folks have handled the. I mean, just look, they can't even handle the imposition of the tariffs. Just for the just for the Chinese tariffs coming in, they don't have the manpower to do that. It's just a matter of time before these poorly trained and armed ICE agents and people that they pull from other federal agencies into these task forces kill a child in the process of trying to apprehend a civilly illegal person in the country. And I think that outrage, we saw what happened with George Floyd for a minute in the country. And that vivid representation, the video of that. And I think the same phenomenon will happen, because they're gonna make mistakes. They're incapable. They're creating a government that doesn't have the infrastructure to protect people. And so I think they're going to see, and they have to do that, because in order to get, to go back to my Youngstown roots, they have to increase the spread for their friends so that they can afford the VIG, which is to pay the Trumps and their folks. And there's no limit on that. And everything else is secondary. I mean, you can, and I talked about this before, as being around the Ohio State House for 40 years. And I was actually there on Thursday. I'm sorry, Wednesday for session. Every bill that passes, you can draw a map to the money that was contributed in order to have that bill become law in the state, or that amendment, or the bills that don't pass. I mean, a great example is the Haslams want to build a $1.5 billion dome stadium in Cleveland, and the legislators are having a ball with this, because the governor wants to increase the tax on online betting to fund the stadium. Many people don't want the government to fund the stadium at all. The legislature wants to float bonds to pay for the stadium. Well, what ties that all together is the Haslams have contributed heavily both to the governor and to the legislature, and so they're getting their payday, and they don't care. They don't care where the $600 million comes from. They just want it, and they don't care. The legislators figured out that if they could push back on the governor, that they could start aggressively fundraising from BetMGM and all those online betting apps that advertise on every sports show that I'm forced now to watch. And their profits and that will come out of the profits, because the odds are the odds, and so the only place that tax would come out is the profits of those very, very profitable new companies. And and that stalemate, will continue until they feel like they've squeezed the last dollar out of all these other folks, and then they'll move on to something else. And the public policy decision is incidental. And the public policy decisions here with Trump, I think, is also incidental to the overall goal of enriching himself and the people that he believes will keep him on his throne, and at the expense of everybody else. But when you start to say things like, at Christmas, it's okay to have less dolls. When you start to say things like, when people start to realize that they aren't going to be able to go to Amazon and get something at a reasonable price in 2 days, that's all going to start to, and you don't have something, evil like the pandemic to blame for causing all that. I mean, they have clearly set themselves up. I mean, they own this. I've never seen a bunch of politicians own an oncoming crisis the way that these guys have owned it. So for the moment, it works to their advantage because they're able to use it to enrich themselves and to enrich their supporters. But when even the MAGA folks start to figure out that their Social Security check's going to be a day or two late because the Doge folks thought, that we should send it third class mail instead of first class mail, or whatever stupid fucking thing these guys come up with these 25-year-olds come up with next, about how to run these agencies. It's like my nightmare. It's like my son coming in and trying to run my law practice. He's the smartest kid I know, but he knows nothing about what I do. And it would be disastrous, but we'd save money, for sure, if that happened. So I think that we're not as far as many people think we are from those real life things starting to happen when it starts to affect the real lives of people. When their kids when the MAGA grandkids can't go to college, those grandparents are going to be a little upset when they, and it may take a year, it may take 2 years, but hopefully, but certainly by 2026, and assuming we have a fair election, that's an opportunity. But as David pointed out, all the Democrats seem to be able to do is send out fundraising messages to us, and they aren't. They started to sharpen their blades for a minute, and then retreated again for reasons I cannot for the life of me understand. There's an opportunity here for somebody to make themselves a permanent historic figure in progressive politics, and nobody is seizing the moment. I mean, other than Bernie Sanders, but he's just doing the same shtick he's always done, and he doesn't have good solutions. Unfortunately, he's got great. He like Trump can identify the problem, but his solutions, aren't gonna carry the day. So where are those people? It is really sad and frustrating to sit back and watch that.
What an amazing point, and a great jumping off point to you, David K., based on a couple of things I want to bring up that we discussed the last time I had the opportunity to join you. But I want to just kind of set it up from this perspective. First of all, of course, we saw Lawrence O'Donnell refer to Donald, pardon me, Donnie Tudall, right? He was straight out of
The Sopranos.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, but the pathology that Mark had just identified, wow, that was amazing. When you consider, based on kind of the breadth and the scope of what we're talking about, you had pointed out, as you have the entire time you've been out there talking about Donald, but revisiting the the criminal activity that you have been, obviously identifying and bringing, full scope of Donald from the beginning, but that connection between what Mark had talked about, the fundraising potentially for whatever party vis-a-vis the pathology of gambling, not to mention that's in the Rust Belt state. So there's a lot of stuff that you can consider, what that all means versus the productivity. And of course, the tariffs aren't to recreate Make America Great Again with, rebuilding our infrastructure. It's to obviously grease the skids for Don and his family, which you started on your journey trying to get under the underbelly of the casino business. I find that a really interesting connection to what you would reveal, how Don has been doing this the entire time. And yet here we are literally 2 days ago where he tells Terry Moran of ABC, look, the Photoshop MS-13 is not what you're looking at. It says MS-13. I don't know if you happen to catch that interview, David.
Yeah, I did.
But he just basically, we all know it was Photoshopped, and he just gaslit everybody to, reconcile, and then he says, I'm in charge of everything except I take orders from my lawyers. Take us from there.
Well, Donald will come up with more and continuing creative ways to avoid and evade responsibility. The current slight downturn in the economy, it's Biden's fault. They're already saying that. That it was in the mix because Biden left a terrible economy behind. And how many people understand the components of GDP and what it means? All of us, but not the vast majority of Americans. So Donald will continue to come up with ways to blame others because he never accepts responsibility. Secondly, he will increasingly try to leverage money out of people. The law firms that agreed to give as much as $100 million of free legal services, that's extortion. But who at the federal level is going to prosecute Donald Trump for an extortion racket? And that's because Donald is a criminal. He's the third generation head of a 4 generation white collar crime family. And we have to recognize that. Hopefully, state attorneys general will find ways to go after Donald over some of the things he's doing because an industry or a company that's being extorted is headquartered in their state. The Democrats, meanwhile, need to have somebody to start speaking truth to power. Now, so far, J.B. Pritzker seems to have done the best. AOC is never going to be the head of the Democratic Party. She is a rabble rouser in the same water as she's a rabble rouser in the same water as Bernie. She's not a manager. You don't want Bernie as president. Trust me. I've spent a lot of time looking at his management style. But until the Democrats come up with a strategy and figure out how to implement it, Donald is going to continue to romp. Now, the courts are beginning to react, not because they've suddenly grown particularly strong spines, but because Donald has basically said, you don't matter, I'll do whatever I want to do. And I'm sorry if you're a self-respecting judge, I don't care who you are, you can't tolerate that. I'm not so sanguine about things going forward that everybody knows, for example, that the the knuckles were photoshopped, or that they care. So far, the data that I've seen on surveys shows that independents are running away from Donald quickly. But Republicans, there's like 1 or 2% reduction in his support. And in some areas, it's actually increased. And this point about religion is very central to this. Many of the people who call themselves Christians, if Jesus were to appear magically, he would be tearing his hair out, going, "What are you doing?" But we have a lot of people who call themselves Christians who believe that your duty is to hate the poor, oppress the stranger, turn away the sick. Now, where this will turn on them, I think, is in a different place. There will be TV news reports within the next 2 years, 3 at the outside, where there'll be some Republican woman who voted for Donald Trump, is all MAGA, and she says, well, my family were very poor. I have 3 children. My husband left us, but I made $10 more than qualifies for Medicaid. So my daughter who has cancer is no longer getting her cancer drugs, and she's going to die. Or because my husband left, my mother has been taking care of us. My elderly mother is 80 years old. She takes care of the children where I work 3 jobs. And her insulin was $25 a month under Biden, and now it's back to $1,000 a month, and that's more than her Social Security check, and she's going to die. Steve Bannon has warned about this, and he's exactly right. They are going to undermine. And then finally, we put out the skinny budget came out today. That's sort of the early narrow version of what's going to be in the budget. It's bigger. It's more spending. And the Doge money claims, which are nothing to do with money, they're about removing accountability for Donald and for Elon Musk. Um, they claimed we're going to do $2 trillion. By their own count, they're at 150 billion in round numbers. The New York Times points out that the costs of laying people off and shutting down contracts are going to be 135 billion. So they've saved $15 billion, which to you, any one of us is an enormous number. To the federal budget is the proverbial drop in the bucket. And now they have a new scam. The Heritage Foundation has come forward with a plan saying that freezing regulations will save $1.1 trillion per year. Now, I read their report, and there's no indication of where they came up with this number. It's just crazy. I would point out it's done by an economist named Bill Beach, who back at the turn of the century created an economic model on taxes. So the Tax Policy Center had a model, Penn had a model, Yale had a model, and then Heritage had a model. And the only one that produced crazy numbers was Bill Beach's at Heritage. But they're going to come up with one new marketing idea, one new distraction, one new diversion after another, because there's no one to stop them in terms of running extortion rackets, prosecuting people who haven't done anything wrong, threatening the licenses of broadcasters, going after the nonprofit status of universities. And he's got plenty of resources to go after all of these things at the same time.
Well, again, a great lead into Bill. I didn't intend it that way to go counterclockwise or clockwise, but Bill, off the heels of what David's talking about, in addition to yesterday was, of course, these May Day marches all over that are, demonstrating that there are hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, that have been in the streets since these 50501 protests began a month ago, which obviously are bringing under the corollary of these signs a lot of what we're talking about here. But David Kay, well, one of the parts of the protests yesterday were attorneys from around the country protesting for the rule of law in context to everything else that we're talking about, right? So you have this complete disconnect between the tall building law firms and their capitulation, like we've talked about in previous weeks. And then you talk about the deregulation on top of the obvious corruption that includes, of course, crypto. Deregulation, crypto, corruption, it's the point, is it not?
So I know it seems just commonplace to start with that Trump lies about everything, right? But it's actually the most important thing, right? Because you can't have anything just work in a world in which everything comes down to lies. So you cannot work in his inner circle, obviously, unless you're willing to not only lie, but do North Korean propaganda, cabinet meetings that are absolutely disgusting to anyone normal. But MAGA seems to have no problem with this type of thing. But that will progress, right? Again, it's not symmetrical. Most presidents are trying to find honest people, not just because honesty is good, because it's essential to everything else. Can I trust this person? Will he or she tell me the truth if asked questions when there are problems, and there will inevitably be problems? Will they accept that there are problems and take responsibility and then go on to fix them? This progresses. It's much easier to be able to screen and find sleazy people. And the easiest way, the easiest screen is, will they make my lies, right? Whatever lies I declare, will they support those lies? That tells me instantly what kind of person there is. Think of the problem of trying to find honest people, right? liars understand when we're trying to screen for them, and they're fairly good about giving answers that sound like they're honest. So he can get 100% and has succeeded in getting 100% people who are not simply liars, but by definition will be sleazy because they're going to go in, as David Kay and as Mark has just said, and it's all going to be a grift. It's been a grift his entire life. David's quite correct. It's been a grift for at least 3 generations leading up to Trump, and his kids are the 4th generation of this grift.
Either.
That means they're all, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm on TV. Can I call you back in 20 minutes?
I will be back.
So what's going to happen? You're going to make telling the truth unacceptable. You're going to make telling truth something you get sued for, something that you get kicked out of the government for, that you get your tax exempt status removed. So when you start with lies, it isn't good enough that the administration core has to adopt this lie. Everything has to adopt this lie, right? And we will use the full force of the government. Here's where I differ slightly from David Kay's statement, but I don't think probably substantively. He doesn't have the resources, right? He's actually suffering, and you can see it in court. He has so many incredibly incompetent people, and there's a reason. If you get all liars, that doesn't work well in court. And that's what, in fact, David Kay was explaining, and Mark Dan. If you come in, even if I'm a Trump appointee as a judge, and you just blatantly lie to me, it destroys my status, right? My self-definition requires me to reject that. And now there are probably 3% who will go there, and he will appoint them to the Supreme Court if he finds them in this process where they're just all in. But overwhelmingly, even Trump judges are going to go against him. The judges and magistrates very recently have said, you're not coming into my courtroom or my chambers anymore unless there is someone taking a verbatim transcript. Think of that.
Yeah.
That has never happened in America. June and I were
Bill,
both.
Bill, there's a line I teach my law students. There is no honor in being a Soviet prosecutor.
Yeah, and there's a famous movie where it's the German judge, and he's condemning someone who was mentally defective in Nazi jargon, and he has a very clever lawyer, and they have the alleged, real person who is obviously suffering from some degree of mental retardation in the old phraseology, right? And his lawyer, the German judge's lawyer at Nuremberg, it gives this vigorous cross-examination and he tears him apart, the witness on the stand. And then the epiphany, of course, is the German judge goes, no, I had decided to convict him before he ever walked into my court. Right? And there will be people like that. And as I say, that'll be how you get to the Supreme Court. But overwhelmingly, there won't be. And so what's happening? At places like the Civil Rights Division, they're losing hundreds of attorneys. They don't care about that, right? Except when they're going to have to defend their blatantly pro-discrimination provisions. And then that lack of expertise is going to be harmful. They have gutted their public integrity section. Well, that's deliberate. You create a more criminogenic environment. You get all the guardrails, all the things that could send you to prison or even cause bad publicity, the whistleblowers, the IGs and such. You target them first. That's fine. But June and I were both attorneys in the federal programs branch of the civil division. We defended the statutory authority and reasonableness of federal regulations and statutes. And that office was created because before the office was created, those were handled in the field in the U.S. Attorney's offices. And the U.S. Attorney's offices, real men, and I gender this deliberately, do big criminal cases. And so it was always given to the people they considered the weakest in their offices. And because jurisdiction and venue in jargon are available against a federal program or statute anywhere in the United States, they always sue you wherever the program is hated the most, right? So they created an honors program and they brought in all these folks to be in this office, federal programs branch, to defend all the top cases in the nation. We cream skim all the top cases. Those folks will not lie in court, right? I mean, maybe 3 out of an office of 115 will do that. And again, they'll be the new bosses, but they do not have the resources. And when you bring in people who A, don't know the substance, B, ain't very good, and 3, they're lying sacks of shit, they're going to come in and think that they can lie to the judge. And boy, we have not yet seen what judges can do to attorneys who lie. And we have to see the bar crack down on the ethics. If you have those things, you will have an immense shortage of highly capable people to defend these programs. And you will establish a reputation nationally that it's the Department of Liars. And at that point, there are going to have very significant problems. But again, back to your point, the state AGs. This is where the state AGs have to come forward and force the Justice Department into making those lies or losing the case or both.
So can I ask a question,
I take it a step.
Mark?
Go ahead.
If you were AG, what would you be doing? What would you be doing if you suddenly became AG again?
Yeah, well, so I don't wish that on me, but I would be well, we'd be bringing these lawsuits on a constitutional basis. I mean, I think the AGs have done a good job of flooding the zone in terms of challenging literally everything that's coming out that has a solid basis to challenge. And I think they're collaborating with each other. I'm actually going to be at a conference of AGs on Tuesday, so I'll report back Friday about what I learned about those strategies. But most AGs don't have criminal prosecution powers, and so I think one of the things, I think you have to add to what Bill says, the local prosecutors. I've actually gotten some traction with my campaign to get the Maryland prosecutor responsible for bring kidnapping charges against the folks that kidnapped Garcia. And I think I believe that the prosecutors in Oklahoma have some work to do, if in fact they're willing to do it. And remember, these folks are particularly in the immigration world. They're all concentrated in more urban communities. There are strong prosecutors there. There are strong elected officials that are in a position to do more, and I think they have the opportunity. The other thing is the defamation laws work both ways, and I think that the private bar has a lot of work to do coming up in bringing those defamation cases. The case law in defamation, thanks to Trump, actually has become very, very favorable to plaintiffs, and so there's going to be money to be made in bringing defamation cases against Trump and his allies. I mean, certainly Elon Musk is a collectible fella if you're able to get a judgment against him. And the fact is, these folks are constantly saying things that are provably untrue, and the consequences for individuals are devastating. So oftentimes with a defamation case, proving damages is hard, but it won't be so hard. And jurors are going to see that. So I think the private bar's got a role both in the disciplinary field and in bringing individual lawsuits, bringing 1983 actions on behalf of individuals, and flooding that zone as well. Because you're right, Bill. There aren't enough competent lawyers in that department to be able to carry the day. And in fact, one of the tragedies is that assuming we survive all this, it's going to take decades to restaff the Justice Department to the level that it was. But as AG, I would be providing, to answer your actual question, providing support to those local prosecutors. What we do is we have the Bureau of Criminal Investigation that we use to support local law enforcement. We can use their tools and their investigators to support them. The AGs can support those individual cases. The AGs can help mobilize the private bar and expand the reach of what they do in order to help. And they have the right to appoint special counsel to do that. And the lawyers can do that. They don't have to get paid to do that work. And if they're patriots, some of them are going to do some things. I mean, given the opportunity, I'm certainly willing, and the colleagues in my office are willing to take on whatever's necessary to get from point A to point B. I mean, when these nonprofits, when the food bank, I mean, the woman who runs the food bank in Cleveland that lives right next door. I mean, when they run out of food because they're not enforcing laws passed by Congress to provide certain supports, that then it's there's a lawsuit there. That can be, I think, successfully prosecuted. Injunctions can be had, and at a certain point, if the courts work the way that I hope if they hold the way that I hope they'll hold, that will be the forum where we can restore a little bit of order.
Boy, I got to tell you, and I don't want to go down this path, but when you were talking about Elon and defamation, I could, if I had the resources, I could identify 1,000 lies per second on X and everything that emulates. And I know what you told me before based on the statutes that protect X, but it's an industrial propaganda machine. And it'd be interesting to get your take on that downstream, especially with some of the other folks that I'm talking about.
Well, and why aren't the Democrats in Congress offering amendments to every bill to get rid of that Section 230 exemption? Why aren't they offering amendments on the floor to these things, at least putting this stuff back on the table? I mean, they're just way too polite for my taste.
Well, I like that. That's again, Mark Dan, everyone. I'll have connections down below or linked into his website. And so if you feel compelled, please either reach out to myself or Mark directly, and I'll certainly accommodate that. But to close this off, June, I was referring some of our previous conversations, and you kind of put an exclamation point on the corruption that's been endemic, really, at the state level for years. And discussion of kind of all of the legislature corruption and crony capitalisms and some of the other things affiliated with it that have made this all possible. Can you elaborate to take us home?
Sure, and I'm going to give you an example, maybe a little far afield, but not so irrelevant. I did a paper after Dobbs with Naomi Kahn, looking at each state which was the most supportive of childbirth. Maternal assistance, the period immediately after childbirth, family-friendly policies. And we discovered there was a pretty good correlation between abortion restrictive states and those that provided the least support for early childhood. Now, it's not a one-to-one correlation because if you put it on the ballot, things like universal pre-K, passed in Oklahoma, passed in Florida, it's popular. But what you see is with the system of federalism, the more local control you have, the more the national corporate lobbying agenda governs. So when we have one-party states red states in particular. You can primary somebody. You can primary somebody with $5,000. $25,000 almost guarantees a victory because few people show up for these elections. And so in the primaries, the corporate lobbying groups will target legislators who aren't with the program. States with a conservative mindset tend to have the smallest budgets for aids. They tend to be part-time legislators. That makes them easier for corporate lobbying groups to capture. Often they pass legislation that the legislators haven't read, drafted by corporate lobbyists. So if you look at things like the minimum wage, again, early childhood support of all kinds, what you see is the low tax, low spend mindset tends to correlate with corporate control, anti-union measures, zero support for workers, and less support for the folks who will be the biggest victims of these budget cuts. The folks who need food from food banks or who need Medicaid. And that's been consistent, not only consistent, it goes back before the Civil War. The South did not have state public education before the Civil War. The rest of the country did. Um, the South, white Southerners were below, immigrants in educational attainment until after World War II. There have been two prosperous eras in the South. Before the Civil War, at the height of King Cotton, when slaves and land rose in value, in part because you couldn't import new slaves, and the period from 1965 to 1975, when the South became part of the richest economy in the world, and the price was civil rights. That's gone. And what we're seeing now is a desire to turn the U.S. into what the South has been for almost all of its existence. One-party rule by the plutocrats, the plantocracy in the old days, the oligarchs in the new days, um, with limited democracy for poor whites. I mean, black citizens have never had a chance to vote, except for that brief period in the civil rights era when multiracial democracy became a possibility. But one party rule to the advantage of the plutocrats is the norm. And we are taking that model, which has impoverished the South for most of its existence. In 1910, the South had death rates that looked like the developed world from infectious diseases. The North did not. We're replicating those patterns. If you look at the last 10 to 15 years, the death rates in red parts of the country have declined. In the more prosperous blue states, they continue to look like Europe. That growing apart by destroying the things that make countries wealthy has been practiced by the South for most of its existence. And that's the model Donald Trump is trying to impose on the entire country.
You meant death rates increased in the red states, right?
Yeah, life expectancy decreased, death rates increased. Right. It's the life expectancy that where the figures are really dramatic. I mean, the US now looks like it's on the road to the developing world. The life expectancy rates in the US are now well below most of the developed world, including much poorer countries than the US. But the regional variances in life expectancy have also increased.
My God, June, you really put two columns together that packed everything together, from the introduction of the manipulation of the psychology of religion to pervert it, and then of all things what we've always learned from Bill, from the perversion of Gresham's dynamic within the law, to realize in many of us from kind of a pop culture standpoint, you might remember the incredible quote by the character Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, when at the very end of the entire story, when they were fighting the existential battle between life and death for all of the human race, the point was from Jon Snow was that when all people do are lies, you just get better and better lies, and nothing means anything, so nothing matters. That was the point of the entire series of Games of Thrones, masked in this, incredibly, fictional, exciting world and everything else. But it just undermines where we are. Guys, I'll give you a chance if you feel compelled. Otherwise, to say goodbye. Okay. Everybody, thank you so much for your time. Until next time, you guys have a great weekend. And everybody, thank you for tuning in. Please share, please like, please subscribe. All the best to you all. Take care.
Take care.